Welcome to Shadowproof. Evidence first, noise last.
Tsunamis are caused by underwater earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or landslides displacing massive volumes of water. These waves can travel across entire ocean basins at jetliner speeds before slowing and growing near shore. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami reached heights over 100 feet in some locations, demonstrating their destructive power. Vertical evacuation to higher ground or sturdy structures is the primary survival strategy during tsunamis. Trees can provide temporary refuge, but survivors must contend with debris, hypothermia, and wildlife displacement. Venomous snakes often seek elevated positions during floods, creating unexpected hazards for human survivors. This creates a survival paradox, where the safest physical location becomes a dangerous biological environment. Modern tsunami warning systems use seismic sensors, sea level monitors, and satellite data to provide advance alerts. The tsunami's force was generated by the sudden vertical displacement of the seafloor during the earthquake. This displacement creates a series of waves that travel across the ocean at jetliner speeds, over 500 miles per hour. In deep water, these waves may be only a foot high, but stretch for hundreds of miles in wavelength. As they approach shallow coastal regions, the waves slow dramatically, and their energy compresses upward. This compression effect can create walls of water reaching heights of 30 feet or more in extreme events. The inundation process involves not just the initial wave, but multiple surges that can travel miles inland. Low-lying coastal areas are particularly vulnerable due to their minimal elevation above sea level. This creates the deadly scenario where drowning becomes an immediate threat across vast areas. In disaster scenarios, standard survival protocols recommend seeking elevated positions. This includes moving to upper floors of structurally sound buildings whenever possible. For individuals caught in open terrain without immediate shelter, climbing a robust tree becomes a final survival option. This action represents a last resort measure when all other evacuation routes are compromised. The effectiveness of this strategy depends on the tree's structural integrity and the nature of the threat. Similar principles apply across various natural disasters, where rising water or ground hazards are primary concerns. This guidance is based on established emergency response protocols observed in multiple documented events. The core objective remains creating distance from immediate ground-level dangers until rescue or conditions improve. Tsunami surges can travel inland at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour, carrying immense force and debris. In flat terrain without buildings or elevated ground, trees become critical survival structures. Climbing above the waterline is essential to avoid drowning and being struck by floating debris. A sturdy tree provides both elevation and something to hold onto against the current's pull. This survival strategy is documented in accounts from various tsunami events worldwide. The choice involves balancing the risk of falling against the certainty of being overtaken by water. Such decisions must be made in seconds, with limited information and overwhelming sensory input. In survival situations, immediate action with available resources often determines the outcome. The climber reached the tree's upper branches, only to discover it was already occupied. Venomous snakes had taken refuge in the tree, likely displaced by the earthquake and rising floodwaters. Earthquakes can disrupt wildlife habitats, forcing animals into unusual locations for survival. The climber was now stranded above dangerous floodwaters, with venomous snakes as his only companions. Flooding creates isolated islands of higher ground that become temporary wildlife refuges. Venomous snakes in defensive positions pose a significant threat to anyone in close proximity. The situation presented a classic survival dilemma: dangerous water below versus dangerous wildlife above. In disaster scenarios, humans and wildlife often compete for the same limited safe spaces. The individual remained in the tree for an extended period, likely multiple days. This duration exposed them to the elements without shelter or supplies. Dehydration became a critical threat as water sources were inaccessible. Snakes remained present in the area, focused on their own survival behaviors. The snakes' activity was a constant environmental stressor, not necessarily a direct attack. Enduring such conditions required immense physical and mental resilience. Similar survival scenarios often involve managing fear and conserving energy. The combination of exposure, dehydration, and wildlife presence created a compounded survival challenge. The man was eventually rescued when the floodwaters receded. Medical treatment was required for exposure to the elements, a common necessity after prolonged immersion in cold water. Accounts vary regarding snake bites, with different reports on the specifics and severity of any envenomation. This variation in accounts is typical in survival incidents, where precise medical details are not always recorded at the scene. The core fact remains that intervention was needed for both environmental exposure and potential venomous injury. There is much we do not know about the exact medical procedures or the full timeline of his recovery. This lack of complete data is a common limitation when reconstructing events from survivor accounts and initial reports. It highlights the gap between the basic outcome of rescue and the detailed understanding of what precisely occurred. The survivor's identity remains largely undisclosed to the public, with few verified details available about the individual. Establishing a precise timeline of events during this incident has proven challenging for investigators and researchers. Many dramatic retellings of this story suggest the survivor was in constant, active combat with multiple snakes. However, wildlife experts note that snakes in such situations typically exhibit defensive behavior rather than predatory aggression. When threatened or cornered, snakes generally prioritize escape and self-protection over hunting. This defensive response is a survival mechanism common to many reptile species when encountering potential threats. The snakes involved were likely terrified by the human presence and reacting defensively to perceived danger. Understanding this behavioral pattern provides important context for interpreting the survivor's experience. The primary threat in this scenario was the environment itself: extreme cold, rising water, and the constant risk of hypothermia. Finding safe drinking water becomes a critical survival priority in such conditions, as dehydration can accelerate hypothermia. Snakes in this situation were not an organized threat, but a dangerous complication, as flooding displaces wildlife from their habitats. Climbing trees during a flood is considered extremely hazardous due to the powerful force of moving water and debris. This action is typically a last resort in survival situations, not standard advice, because trees can be uprooted or struck by floating objects. The combination of cold water immersion and physical exhaustion creates a rapid path to hypothermia, even in moderate temperatures. In flood conditions, debris acts like battering rams, making any elevated position precarious and potentially deadly. This illustrates how survival scenarios often involve managing multiple simultaneous threats rather than a single clear danger. This case demonstrates a critical survival pattern. Decisions are often made between immediate, certain death and a perilous chance at life. The individual chose the known threat of moving water over the potential threat of remaining in a compromised position. This reflects a common dilemma in disaster scenarios, where all options carry significant risk. The outcome revealed that both threats combined, turning a calculated risk into a compounded danger. This pattern is observed in various natural disasters, where secondary hazards often emerge from initial survival choices. The mechanics involve rapid environmental changes that can merge separate dangers into a single, overwhelming event. Comparisons can be drawn to other documented cases where evading one threat led directly into another. This highlights the brutal reality that survival in extreme conditions often involves navigating between catastrophic options. Major disasters create compound chaos, where multiple catastrophic events cascade. An earthquake can trigger secondary events like tsunamis, which then displace wildlife populations. This displacement brings secondary survival challenges beyond the initial disaster. Preparedness must account for both the primary event and the shattered world that follows. This pattern occurs in documented disasters, where infrastructure collapse compounds natural events. Effective disaster planning considers these cascading effects and their duration. The core lesson aligns with standard disaster preparedness. Know the natural threats specific to your region. In coastal zones, this means knowing tsunami evacuation routes to high ground or sturdy, multi-story buildings long before a warning sounds. Your planned refuge should be a structure, not a tree, as buildings provide more reliable protection against powerful water forces. This principle applies to various natural disasters, where vertical evacuation to engineered structures proves more effective than seeking shelter in natural features. The timing is critical. Evacuation routes must be memorized and practiced before any emergency occurs, as warning systems provide limited advance notice. Multi-story buildings offer protection through their structural integrity and elevation above ground level during flood events. This approach represents a fundamental shift from reactive response to proactive planning based on geographical risk assessment. This man's story demonstrates human endurance against overwhelming circumstances. His initial lack of options represents the exact scenario that preparedness training aims to prevent. Survival in such extreme conditions requires choosing between multiple deadly natural forces. This situation forces a decision where both options present severe, potentially fatal risks. Even the most rational decision in a crisis can lead to unimaginable physical and psychological trials. Such survival stories highlight the complex relationship between preparation, decision-making, and endurance. The will to live can push humans beyond what seems physically possible in extreme situations.
If the proof convinced you, subscribe and open the next case.